Preparing for this conference, I wondered a bit how different, in fact, policies, structures, aims, goals, and instruments are that are used in cultural policy today. And so I made what we call in our jargon a quick and dirty exercise from our compendium of cultural policies and trends. And this led to, don't look too much, it's still in working on individual figures, but what you see at a glance is cultural policy making in Europe is still very distinct, very different. The scheme goes on, and I marked in yellow one of these indicators, namely whether or not there exist strong language policies, and you will see it is still very different in Europe. We are facing very different conditions, very different goals, priorities, and that is something that shows we haven't yet arrived, maybe, it's good to say that, in a melting pot of culture policies. On the other hand, we might have missed opportunities for cooperation within the European terrain. We are obviously facing an expansion of scope, and yesterday I was happy to learn that, for example, Lithuania might include in the future traditional food or its habitat into the fields to be addressed through cultural policies. Congratulations. This is fine to expand the scope of cultural dimension into other sectors of society, and it could, in some cases, help us to actually cash in what has been promised by the European Union in its treaties since Maastricht, namely, and I quote, to take cultural aspects into account in its action under other provisions of this treaty. Raising the rank of culture on political agendas should, in this view, result in financial benefits, not least within programs of the well-heeled EU structural funds. Nobody summarizes this expectation better than Monika Smolen, as you can see here in this quote. However, these expectations she had and many of us had were not really met in reality. During the now ending funding period until 2013, less than 2% of EU contributions in the structural funds went into cultural in the larger sense, and actually mostly into heritage projects, and in this way mobilized only to a very limited extent the potential creativity and inspiration offered by artists and other contemporary actors in the cultural sector. If I interpret the signs from Brussels correctly, there are little chances that this rate may go up decisively during the next 7 years funding period. To make it very clear, I do not blame the European Commission for the apparent failure of recognizing the relevance of cultural projects, and it's also not the question that potential benefits of such projects are not yet evident enough as proposed in the theme of this session. The relevance and the benefits have indeed been widely demonstrated by a large number of concrete success stories. Our institute, as well as others, for example, CSES or KEA, did our very best to actually translate these outcomes via empirical studies for the Commission, the European Parliament, into the evidence accepted and the jargon used by the architects of structural funding. No, blocking culture from achieving a better standing in such programs is mainly caused by member states. Not all of them, I readily admit. They are responsible, but for the operational programs where contemporary and traditional arts, design, new media, experiments, socio-cultural activities could be given, as the European Parliament once called it so nicely, pride of place. in a resolution 2008. There have been and will surely be in the future great differences in the way member states have handled this issue. Some, like the United Kingdom, attribute only 0.3% of structural funds money to culture. Others, like Estonia, reach a fair share of 2%, and Italy, for example, came close to 3%. So there is an apparent difference already now of how these funds are used for culture, and that is taking place in the member states. In the end, we have to ask ourselves, as citizens or as decision makers, whether we have done enough of persuading those in charge of EU programs to make Monica Smolen's vision come true and recognize the social, economic, and other dimensions and chances of culture in development policies. Let me add here another almost contradictory point, which may surprise you, since I'm an empirical researcher who is doing this type of work for over 40 years. But I think I have to voice a caveat against a too extensive definition of scope of present-day European culture policy making, as long as this cannot lead to practical consequences. Whether we like it or not, we must first do our homework in our security domain, and that is still the arts and heritage today. In my experience, the former willingness of a great many, and not only cultural politicians and administrators, to take for granted that some areas in society, and particularly the arts, have an intrinsic value and need support even if their material or practical benefits are not always evident at first sight, has faded rapidly. Would we do this, for example, in physics or in legal affairs? For many reasons, foundation sponsors and private philanthropists cannot, as we have heard from colleague Sacco, or at least not in a sustainable manner, take their place in Europe. I must confess I'm a bit haunted by the thought that to a certain extent many among us cultural experts, managers or operators, as it's now nicely called, may have actually contributed to this collapse of a protective shield with our translation and expansion efforts, that is, linking the arts preferably with economic, political, or educational effects. No question, these effects exist, and incidentally, I was one of the first to always underline them in my studies. But on the other hand, we should not try to overestimate economic dimension, especially in the arts and media. A Swedish rock formation, Mando Diao, put it very nicely. They say, if you don't have good songs, business plans won't help. During the past years, the preoccupation with the so-called creative industries led to many of such errors. And we also should look into certain policy orientations that help us to understand that there are different viewpoints which we could consider. Like, for example, what the French are calling exception culturelle. Last 2 years ago in Tallinn, a manifesto for the creative economy tried to balance these both traditional and new views, and I think they have come to an interesting approach. My own ideas about this are sort of put together in such a scheme and involve both the traditional or endogenous values and possibilities, as well as new trans-regional and international marketing efforts and new digital content technology. With the creative industries challenge, however, we have been led into many sort of dead-end streets, not the least because of the definitions used in this context and the expectations, the overstated expectations caused by it. Cultural policymakers possibly felt flattered because of the sudden expansion of what was now supposedly their field of influence. But does it really match their competencies? Could the Minister of Culture of a German land really hope that he could match to impress Google or Microsoft and put them into his portfolio? What policies, concrete policies, could he or she really implement in those cases? Many politicians were also dazzled by the assurance of permanent growth and many more jobs as promised by some consultancies. And as you can see, these consultancies were taken by real surprise when suddenly all things went totally different. There is no automatic growth machinery in the so-called creative industries. Thanks to empirical evidence provided by Eurostat and specialized national research experts, we should know by now how volatile many of these branches are, especially in times of economic crisis. While it is true that more and more mostly micro-business are starting, in fields like design, film production, or pop music, the revenue gained in the respective field often does not keep pace with that growth, and the creation of sustainable jobs is even lagging farther behind. As much as we would welcome should welcome creative entrepreneurs, as much we should also provide them with fair market chances, avoid undercapitalization, and encourage cooperative activities. As good practices in some countries demonstrate, for example, in countries like Austria, Estonia, Finland, Poland, and many more, such tasks usually go beyond the power and resources of cultural administrations. Transversal partnerships should be taken within and beyond national and local governments, often in the form also of joint marketing agencies that are the order of the day, and hopefully we will see more of them in the future. Because the creative sector, and I take here the one in my own country, does not deliver what many people expect from him.